Right. Hi, I'm Frank. I'm also known as a sincere, frankly rapper. I've got a few artistic names, but strictly speaking, this is not what this is about. It's not about my hip hop music and my rap vandalism. This is about a book, and the book is right here. I was recommended to read it by a Facebook friend. Big up Nathaniel, and he recommended that I read this book. It's called Racial Matters. It's about the FBI and a secret file on Black America. The dates are from 1960 to 1972, and it's written by Kenneth O'Reilly. This book apparently is a very important book about American history and the likes of racial matters in America and the federal government, and from Latinos to blacks, etc., the immigration laws and politics. So, getting back to the book, I just have to make a slight transition from where I'm going. I haven't really read the book in full. I've looked at articles on the internet to do with it, PDFs, where the book has been reviewed under scholarships and by others who are dissecting all the information from the book, and they've written PDFs or other website like articles online. To summarize, would not be so brief. After all, I'm going to have to basically spend a few days making this online media event video, bit by bit, during each day, and digesting as much of the information I can from online and from the book itself. Where I'm going to start with this book, I'm going to start with chapter 7. I was looking for one of the most relevant chapters to start the video with, and although chapter 1 is extremely pertinent, I want to start this video with chapter 7 from this book, which is about the white backlash against the likes of the black community and Latino community, and how displaced all of the political arguments were at the time within the secrecy of the file. That's all to do with the likes of the racial matters in this book. So the chapter itself, White Backlash, chapter 7, it states here, LBJ and the politics of the urban riots. So let's go to that page quickly. 229 in the publication that I've got. Just going to pause the video and then sort myself out, and I'll start again. Okay, as I stated with chapter 7, White Backlash, LBJ and the politics of the urban riots. LBJ is a person called Lyndon B. Johnson. The Kennedy Library Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities says that Lyndon B. Johnson is part of the foundation, or at least, and it's all to do with the American Philosophical Society. In brief, at the beginning of the chapter, it starts to go into Viola Liuzzo's, pardon me for my terrible pronunciation if I've said it wrong, and the tragic murder presented within its public relations, and the actual dilemma that's occurred. For J. Edgar Hoover and a public relations opportunity for the likes of Lyndon B. Johnson at the time. The riots that began in New York in the summer of 1964 that swept right through the urban north in the years thereafter, which was extremely tragic, and presented opportunities only for the FBI director, not the president. So obviously the director at the time was J. Edgar Hoover. He was the director of the FBI. The ghettos erupted in Watts in 1965, in Newark and Detroit in 1967, and seemingly confirmed by Hoover's lifelong assumption that the subversion that took place, and not the racism that lay right at the heart of what was going on, could only be explained by the deeds of the communist conspirators at the time, and not by the forces of poverty and despair that were being experienced within the likes of the black communities and the Latino communities, and other immigrants to America at the time. So typically America and its politics is littered with rhetoric. It mentions it here that the new rhetoric at the time of the law and order to deal with the archaic rhetoric. It's like old, and it's a way to make a point of old rhetoric. To deal with the old rhetoric for the likes of the domestic Cold War that was part of that nation's structure whilst all the riots were going on, led to a lot of, obviously, interference and insurgency from the likes of the communist parties within America, urban America, and the ghettos, and further afield, obviously into the burbs and everything. So there states here that there's a secondary cause, or like a reaction, within the national state of affairs at the time, that were increasingly partisan to the debates over the causes of the riots that were taking place, and the liberalism of it, not so much the communism at the centre of most of the controversy, but the liberalism that was taking place. So it gets to be quite interesting. Obviously, I mentioned the Philosophical Society, American Philosophical Society. So going back to the likes of LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, and he's admitting within the administration of the argument that it's more or less the riots were really a result of a war on poverty within the most poorest communities of America that were filled with immigrants, and the Great Society initiatives that were seen as a way to make things better, like the solution to the likes of the ghetto and their poverty-stricken plight, didn't get to be the great American solution to the dilemma after all. And the president's adversaries in this, the likes of the Republican Party and the conservative wing, that's within his own party, that were actually blamed for the permissiveness of liberal reform. So causing more chaos and crime within the cities, and the ghettos to those infrastructures. This is where it gets a bit interesting. I'm just going to pause the video and then try to like cut a long story short. I'm just doing some more reading. My research is getting even better. I did a major like fluff earlier, and had my presidents of America completely arse backwards. Nixon was not the president of America during 1968. Lyndon B. Johnson was the president of America during 1968. How do you think I feel about that? I didn't even realise. I didn't know really until I took a better look. So that's that. The president of America during 1968, at the time of the crisis and disorder, that is the riots, and their racial matters that I'm trying to cover as a review within the book I'm reading that was recommended by my Facebook friend. The president at the time is Lyndon B. Johnson. 1968, that's around the same time as Vietnam, at least the beginning of, where policies were falling apart and were badly managed. I mean, speaking for myself, my granddad, he did a term in the British Army during the 70s and did a tour in Korea, which is coincides with what was going on in Vietnam during the 70s. So of the early 70s, before I was born, and that. I was born in 76. So before that, it's the beginning, literally around the beginning of the 70s. So interestingly enough, J. Edgar Hoover himself, who was the director of the FBI, he had it in for the black community like nobody else, and was determined to intrude every corner of the black community and investigate them all while this was going on. And he was exploiting the Lyndon B. Johnson foundation and philosophical like understanding to his own ends, really, within his position and his status and role at the FBI. Interestingly enough, it mentions that later in the year of 1968, the politics against the president himself, Nixon, at the time, and his interests and favour was chased to that of the white backlash vote, interestingly enough. This obviously caused clashes between the likes of Lyndon B. Johnson and that of the 6th director of the FBI, who J. Edgar Hoover was. And the clashes, obviously, there's more to the clashes than just the likes of that. There's the communities themselves in America and the civil disorder that was breaking out. This law and order this law and order, well, it's so much a regime, the regime of it, and the debate of it, as well as in the management of it, all leads up to the politics of it occupying the Oval Office. So I'm just going to leave it there and I'll come back to that. Right, I'm just skimming through some of these pages. I have not looked online yet because there's a couple of things I want to like cite for reference sake. just to see if I can get some sort of concise meaning to what I'm trying to look up. It does make a point of the language of federalism at the time, and the likes of federal surveillance, and what that meant to black communities within the black ghettos of America. So I'm just going to take a bit of a look now. Right, well, I've just put my my search tag reference into Google. I always use Google, and basically it's come up with scholarly articles that are related to 1968 and the language of federalism and federal surveillance. It's saying here on the first page, it's talking about the necessaries of security and the security of free states and the federal government itself, defining the composition of a militia and the auxiliary rights provided, and the going on about anti-federalists and maintaining the Constitution by preventing state efforts to destroy that or corrupt it and what have you. So talking about mass surveillance here in the United States, as it mentions like in Wikipedia, going on about the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution. Well, I'd probably want to take a look at that in something to understand it more briefly. So if I just put that in, so let's have a look. Fourth Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, and the Constitution, through the Fourth Amendment, protects people from unreasonable searches and seizures by the government. The Fourth Amendment, however, is not a guarantee against all searches and seizures, but only those that are deemed unreasonable under the law. So there we go. I'm just noticing how it highlights all the interferences from everybody who's actually white, white Americans, who have undoubtedly interfered within the likes of this crisis that's taking place. So it's mentioning the FBI a lot, so it should, and how they published a manual on the likes of urban violence at the time in the prevention and control of riots, with the assistance of the US Army and the approval of the Civil Rights Division. So which is fairly interesting. Trying to keep this short and snappy anyway. I don't want to just waffle on. Get back to this. So on the other page, there's an interesting bit. It says here, at the time, the Bureau, it's the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and its agents, the agents were used as professional counter-subversives. So it's a counter-terrorism thing when they counter the likes of the riots and the corruptions and the language of corrupt parlance that was inciting everyone and interfering within the communities and the ghettos and that. And obviously the controversy of all the attention, the media attention and everything that likes of the issues and riots and everything that is going on in the crisis and disorder of it. So it was all sort of very just, it's all in your face, everywhere you go, from the newspapers to the TV and the radio and everything, and people talking about it relentlessly and stuff like that. And then the likes of all the rest of the interference that was corrupting it and making matters even worse, stirring up hate crimes and stuff like that. So they were used as professional counter-subversives, not just as amateur sociologists at the time. So it's very interesting. Pause it there. Right, reading on, I just noticed that Eisenhower is now getting involved. Obviously, he's of the military. This is actually before he was actually president. So, like, you can see that he's been like involved now. Here, getting him involved. It goes on with the dilemma, and it mentions here, which I thought this was quite interesting, where radical black nationalists said the war on poverty and civil rights reforms confirmed the elitism of liberal politicians. The movement's left wing demanded power, not paternalism, and offered a critique of the Great Society that undermined the president's constituency. From the skewed perspective of the radical left, the movement's principal enemy was not the red-necked Southern sheriff, or the reactionary senator from Mississippi, or the nihilistic rioters, or even the reluctant FBI director. Liberal reform was the enemy. LBJ was the enemy. The radicals' exaggerated focus on liberalism as an enemy of black people fractured the movement and put one more crack in Johnson's constituency. I'm just having a look online about what I was just like reading, and it mentions the negative constitution and the critique of that to the very resolve of the crisis and its disorder that was extremely disruptive to the likes of the Constitution and its law and order at the time. And you can see that there's so much denial and criticism involved from the likes of everybody that interfered to make matters worse. So within the process of that itself, to the likes of the resolve that was required to deal with the situation and transform not just the debate, but the likes of how people were being treated at the time. Obviously, there's a lot of illegitimacy that was going on within the likes of the managing of that, and the language involved, a very painful imposition, and it resulted in a lot of things, not just resulted in the likes of in the courtroom, from not just from debate and stuff, to like the likes of the community, but like to the courtroom as well, and the constitutional law at the core of all of that. So which is like, if you think in terms of like things like public opinion to the likes of private opinion, and then political opinion, and everything in between, that even counters the positive to and counters the negative, encountering the negative with the positive, and so on. So like, and it takes a certain amount of expertise, to deal with it and not mess it up and make it worse. So, because it's a very sensitive subject, when you start to get into like the fundamental rights of everyone, no matter whether they're black or white, it doesn't matter what colour they are, just the fundamental rights of human beings. And any controversy involved that the likes of inequality, especially racism, and so just taking a little look, it mentions there's comparisons with what went on in Iraq, which is interesting. It starts to get into issues on censorship around the importance of positive criticism. Obviously, there is such a thing as positive criticism, compared with the likes of like a negative denial, and its negative criticisms. So, and then, I mean, if you start to bring issues like free speech into the picture, free speech is something we don't have in England. We don't have that right. There's no such thing as free speech, and no such thing as being allowed to protest. You're allowed to petition, but you're not allowed to protest. You're certainly not allowed free speech, not in the UK. So, interestingly enough, and you start to get into the First Amendment as well, is coming into the picture, and how should the media get involved in the likes of these kind of campaigns when everything hangs in the balance? I mean, like, should they or should they not? Because they sensualize everything, don't they? And then that can make matters worse. Well, you start to understand that, you know, your future is more important than ever, and that when your rights are being so terribly managed, and obviously of question as well, it seems to bring light to a whole lot. The argument itself brings light to a whole lot of issues that are extremely negative. If I just put the First Amendment first. So we covered the Fourth, and we're looking at the First Amendment. The First Amendment provides that Congress make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting its free exercise. Let me read that to you one more time. The First Amendment provides that Congress make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting its free exercise. It protects freedom of speech, the press, assembly, and the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So this is what I mean with the resolve, because when you have a complaint, and you're stigmatized within there, this all to do with stigma. If your complaint's all to do with stigma, you deserve redress, and redress is resolve. That's the way to sort the problem out. So that's, interestingly enough, that's really interesting. So from the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment, you get a clearer picture of the likes of troubles that was taking place, and all the stigma that was attached within the racism and the what's the word? Cynicism. I mean, it was really exaggerated, really over the top, like cynicism, wasn't it? Don't you think that, like, the likes of like J. Edgar Hoover was like overly cynical in a really negative way, and which just made matters worse, stirring people up and rubbing people up the wrong way for all the wrong reasons, and stuff like that. And the situation just escalated and escalated, didn't it? So like, I'll just stop there. I'm just eating a bit of cake. Yum yum. I'm just thinking, I thought of a phrase, the phrase adding salt to the wound. So if someone or something rubs salt into the wound, they make the unpleasant situation that you're in even worse. often by reminding you of your failures or faults. To rub salt in the wounds is like the bankers got big bonuses as the rest of us struggle to make ends meet and stuff like that. So what does it actually mean? What does a phrase like that actually mean? It's when you make a difficult situation even worse for someone, when it's bad enough that that it's wrong. Everything's not right at the time, and everything's going wrong. So that's basically what the phrase is getting at. Yeah, it's a good one. That one, I like that. It's exactly what I'm reading into to like understand fully that that's exactly what was carried on at the time. It makes me think of quotes. I might look for a quote to see if I can find a quote that's associated with the likes of 1968 and what was going on. See if I can do that. Salt into the wound. Quote. So 1968 quote. Well, as I'm looking, in American ones, so it just seems to be British, where it's going into lots of Cambridge and Oxford. The irony of phrases, yeah, it's a good one. Like, trauma's a victim of irony. Even that might not help, especially the start. It's so. I mean, you can't just say you're so sensitive. They're like, what, at a time like this? How could you really? Like, so let's look. What have we got here? Can I view them all? So like, here we go. Any that related to 1968 and that, anyone? Here's Rolling Stones. Rolling Stones. Exile on Main Street. So like exile. What's that? Exile on Main Street. I'm trying to. Yeah, I think that's what it's saying. Exile, America, and the theatre of the Rolling Stones, 1968 into the 1970s. Exile on Main Street. Right. That's Rolling Stones, the band. It's a terrible thing. The picture is terrible. The black guy is, and he's got like balls in his mouth, 3 balls in his mouth. It's not very nice. That guy is already dead. It looks like Aristotle. So I'm trying to have a look. Is there anyone in the likes of... And that doesn't seem to be very forthcoming, except for the Rolling Stones one. I'm trying to see... There's no easy way to be able to tell. You know what? I'm going to leave it there, because otherwise I'll just be there wasting your time while you watch it. Sorry about that. Back in a minute. That noise in the background, if you can hear it, that's my kettle. I'm just making a herbal tea. So I'm just looking at this paper here that I'm reading. It's in a PDF format. It talks about repeated analysis of voting in America as far back as 1976 to the likes of more recently in 2012, and how a gorge of gauges and roles in immigration and presidential contests, in the likes of elections for Congress and the Senate, plus governors and beyond, have all led to what Americans realise from past assessments and the circumstances and influences, all associated to the likes of immigration and immigration-related views and problems. So I'll take a better look at it. My kettle's almost ready. It's almost boiled. So. But you know what? I was still reading about 1968. It gets even more interesting. Apparently, all the voting that was going on, victories and losses. Apparently, Nixon won a resounding victory of importance in New Hampshire. Primary on March 12th with 78% of the vote. There's all the anti-war Republicans and what they're writing. And the New York governor at the time, Nelson Rockefeller. And Republican parties, leaders of the Republican parties, that is, and the liberal wing of it, with the vote percentages and everything that was going on, and Nixon's new challenger at the time, who actually won the presidency during 1968, is Republican former Vice President. Says, right, in the presidential election, Republican former Vice President Richard Nixon was defeated by the Democratic incumbent Vice President Hubert Humphrey. Nixon won the popular vote by less than 1 point, but took most states outside the Northeast and comfortably won the electoral vote. So now, stating just briefly, having said that, and the lessons learned from the elections of 1968, there's an article there with poetry about the electoral saga in the New Yorker during the 1968 presidential election. Opinions about the President Lyndon B. Johnson, the Vice President Hubert Humphrey, and the tragedy of Hubert Humphrey. I've not actually read this. I don't know too tough what it's about. The US House of Representatives during 1968. Richard Nixon's elected president. Short article on the history of that, and how he defeated the Vice President Hubert Humphrey. So if we just go on, right, so it's saying Lyndon B. Johnson was the President of the USA during 1968. The Vice President was Hubert Humphrey. Right. With American Independent Party nominees, Governor George Wallace. Obviously, the Republican nominee was the former Vice President Richard Nixon. Lyndon B. Johnson served as the 36th President of the United States from 1963 till 1969. The 37th vice president from 1961 to 1963, and he actually assumed the presidency following the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Right. Right. Well, that's quite interesting. I'd like to read on the tragedy of Hubert Humphrey in brief. That seems a bit in tragedy. Hubert Humphrey. It said that Hubert Humphrey died on the 13th of January 1978. And he was the vice president for Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon B. Johnson was impeached, apparently. A primary charge against Johnson was that he had violated the Tenure of Office Act passed by Congress in March 1867 over his veto, specifically removed from office. Pardon me. And obviously Johnson escalated the war in Vietnam. By February 1965, the situation had morphed into perilous anarchy by a coup. As between Johnson's escalation in Saigon, falling on 7 different governmental factions. So America lost South Vietnam. It was an artificial construct created in the wake of the French loss of Indochina. It never was an organic nation of South Vietnam. The US discontinued its invested military assets in that construct, and eventually it ceased to exist. So the Kennedy administration is what Lyndon took over, and Kennedy policies led to the implementations of the Bay of Pigs and the invasion and escalation of the Vietnam War. So Hubert Humphrey, back to Hubert Humphrey and the tragedy of Hubert Humphrey. Hubert Humphrey was not a conservative, is anti-communist and a liberal. Is making associations about his administration, and he was a strong advocate on the war in Vietnam and policies. It also mentions something about the Senate, and then how Richard Nixon was called prior to Hubert Humphrey's death and invited to attend his funeral. And a Great Society period. Well, that's a bit interesting. So obviously, in terms of the tragedy, is to really get into the biographical facts about Hubert Humphrey and the presidency, his vice presidency, and action in the cause of his death and everything. So like, that's what that's getting into. So if we just look at the Great Society, in terms of like, take a quick look at that. Stop that. Whoa, I just noticed. Apparently, he had complications with a hernia in his right scrotum. The right of his scrotum, that is. So, there you go. Hubert Humphrey had a hernia in the right side of his scrotum, which is obviously an implication in his health that led towards the cause of his death, ultimately. Yeah. So I've gone for a concise definition on exactly what the Great Society in the US is in terms of its history. The Great Society was a set of domestic programs in the United States launched by the Democratic President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1964 to 1965. It's coined so like by terms, coined for during a 1964 speech by President Lyndon B. Johnson at the University of Michigan, and came to represent his domestic agenda. So, right, I see. Let's have a look at why it's so significant. The Great Society was an ambitious series of policy initiatives, legislation and programs spearheaded by President Lyndon B. Johnson, with the main goals of ending poverty, reducing crime, abolishing inequality, and improving the environment. There you go, that's what the Great Society is all about. How about that? Right. So I'm just taking a look at the state level policy that was introduced in 1968 in America, and the history of that. It says that 1968 is the year that changed America forever. In 1968, the country seemed to be having a nervous breakdown as battles erupted over Vietnam and the cultural values within America, plus all the racial matters and race issues that were going on. So I'm being taken away from what I was just reading, which was a news article, to how policy works. And policy works in government affairs and public relations, passionately advocating the causes and championing the message. So it's a bit interesting. It's not really what I wanted to look at exactly. So if I just scroll on, in 1968 it was a hinge point in history, one of the most consequential and tumultuous years in the American experience, and it changed the country forever. Yes, I'll continue as myself, that's fine, just verify that. And it changed the country forever. One traumatic event followed another as a wide array of social and political trends that have been building for years reached a critical mass. Right, so this is what we're talking about. During a span of 12 months, half a century ago, there were two shocking assassinations, growing and sometimes violent oppositions to the escalating Vietnam War, hardening class differences, severe economic problems, and increasingly impatient civil rights movement that gave rise to a combative and angry black power advocates. Well, that's interesting. That wasn't all. There was a rise in feminism, doubts about the credibility of the nation's leaders, and growing rebellion from young people against their parents and their values, campus revolts against authoritarian administrators and lifestyle constraints, a new sexual freedom made possible by the birth control pill, and overall a ferocious culture war over values issues such as abortion, crime, patriotism, prayer in school, freedom of speech, and respect for institutions. All of this dramatised and magnified by popular culture and increasingly aggressive news media eager to hold political and cultural leaders accountable for society's shortcomings. Well, that's what it is. I'll leave it there. So yeah, I'm just thinking on white backlash, and what I understand it in my own words. Well, I'd understand it as an interference within the likes of a situation and the scope on that is within the range of, obviously, within identity politics and issues. So it's very racial, and the inequality of that. So in terms of a mob mentality is something that helps me understand it. Just looking at what Wikipedia says, Wikipedia actually says that white backlash and white rage is the negative response of some white people to the racial progress of other ethnic groups in their rights and opportunities. The growing cultural parties, political self-determination, and dominance. So with that, it's white racists against black civil rights advances. You're talking in terms of like terms like liberty. What liberty means in liberty of truth, and it's a quality, a state of being free and the power to do as one pleases within the liberty of the truth. Freedom from physical extraint and freedom from arbitrary or despotic control. And the positive enjoyment, the social, political, and economic rights and privileges that we're all entitled to in our fair share of life, living our life within the liberty of truth. So, which is of our rights. Doesn't matter what colour you are. Doesn't matter if you're Scottish, Irish, Welsh, British. Doesn't matter, or you're all of that, or your ancestries from Europe, and furthermore, all the way back to the likes of Africa, and all the African migration that's gone on throughout the world, and acclimatization of melanin, and leaving the likes of paler people to the likes of their own generation after generation for more and more paler people who obviously at the roots of all of that are of black people. So and their black families. There we go. So that's quite interesting. So what I'm reading at the moment is getting me a bit sidetracked because it's a little bit too modern. It's taken off from the dates I originally wanted to review. It's making more of a point in a contemporary way throughout the 80s and 90s, especially the millennia, where it's looking at American history and the issues of race and issues of tradition, and that with its view on the likes of black-white dichotomy and the duality within that, and the nation's economic, social, cultural and political spheres that have all brought about change with the peoples and the dynamics of all those policies and the politics of it, obviously for equality and fairness, where the truth's concerned. So it also makes what I'm reading that is made quite a point on the Latino community as well within white America, and the rapidly growing immigrant population of all immigrants from the likes of South Americans as well, who are integrated into the American population, and Turkish people as well, as along with the Europeans and the British of that and everything else. And the Caribbean to the West Indies and African, everybody. So it's quite interesting. Obviously, I wouldn't want to leave out Asia and the Asian and Jewish community as well, the Pacific Asian community to it, and all the primary determinants of all the political decision making and derisions and fragmentations within that cultural diversity that has driven communities apart and also brought communities together as a result, from failure to success. So I'm just going to leave that paper there because I can't keep reading that. So looking at chapter 7, it all seems to be centered around education and society, as well as the governance to society within the US nation of the peoples, and all importantly, that education leads us all to understand things like civil rights and race relations involved in civil rights. Don't ever get those keywords wrong. Civil rights. So never mistake them for the opposite. And the discourse, as well as the disregard within the imposed regard that was so negative at the time, is my point, and around all other kind of issues of governance and society. So dissecting the dream in as briefly and concisely as I can. Trust, safety, truth, fairness, equality. Other arguments that were topical at the time served to just pollute more relevant arguments right at the doorstep of the nation of peoples that were having serious problems with up the road, down the road, and everywhere in between. Racism, of course, is bad. It's wrong. It's extremely negative. It's a serious form of inequality, which is unfair. And that's about as best as I can understand chapter 7. I will see what I can do with the end of the chapter. Right now I need to get back to my herbal tea and finish off my last bit of cake. Soften out. So, as in short, as briefly as I can, chapter 7 highlights with great emphasis the derision and the discourse that's taken place within all the discrimination and segregation that permeated every aspect of American life at the time, including that of government, although, because they're government after all, but on assessing all the hardships and not understating what should be overstated within the circumstances and the influences that took place at the time because of every consequence of all the trouble. The years of rioting within all of this and the corruptions that served to be a nuisance and a menace, also regarded as a subversion, um, uh, without exaggerating the American dislike and dispute of communism and communists. This situation serves to be understood as a bureaucrat's imperative. So when we get back on what I was saying earlier, back to the point of dilemma. A dilemma is a moral thing. So you have a moral dilemma. That means there's a moral imperative. It deserves to be realised and sorted out. A solution needs to be in place. There needs to be resolved. So getting back to the redress on stigma and the appropriate language that's required to deal with a sensitive subject like this topic. Being white and nothing but white, like that's all you can be centered on being white, doesn't help, especially even more so if you're white and racist. There's a way to understand all this troublesome point is spread about on page to page throughout the chapter, and all the ways that the language and communication is broken down within every aspect of it. Like the way to understand the situations like this, for instance, like I made a product which is has a really banal title. Really, it's not a very original title because it's one of those phrases that has just been around for years. Where the title of the product itself, a sound clip on my Elkanah sound clip, it's called "Language is a Virus," and it's all to do with fear and hatred, and how language is infectious, and especially the wrong type of language, inappropriate, negative types of language, and how inappropriate and negative fear and hatred really is anyway, besides, without the likes of every bit of adverbial modification type communication nonsense interfering left, right and centre. So like and that it's a thrilling product in itself, but take them with a pinch of salt and don't be too extreme with it. There's something very literal there at the root of it. Try not to get carried away with how it's a little bit horrifying of me to get my kicks out of it a little. So American hardship and American troubles. As far as I can tell, as far as I know, Americans live for argument. They just live to argue with each other. For all I can tell, especially when it comes to politics and stuff like that, all they ever do is seem to thrive and on living for dispute. It's just kind of cool in a way. Although, but there we go. Chapter 7. That's the best I could do. It sort of took me 5 minutes, just over. that's all for this chapter. There will be other chapters. I will add them to the playlist at my YouTube. The event itself at Facebook, I mean, I had problems. There was one particular online media event at Facebook that I originally started with that I had to postpone, and I just followed suit with that and postponed others that I had lined up in my schedule. I've taken more than 2 months to sort this out. I apologise. Sorry. I had to get a new laptop and whatnot and stuff. I'm still having problems. There has been an ICO fine served, although under the circumstances, the ICO fine is it's relevant. It's very relevant, but it's actually been served to an agency, an organisation, an agency within a local authority. Pardon me, within a local authority connected to my public inquiry, which is actually separate from the hacking and cyber terrorism that I do experience from time to time, and issues that I did have at Facebook that were very relevant. Sorry to have to make you wait. I hope this is alright. It's the best I can do for now. You might not see little pictures popping up on the screen and that, and it'll lack whatever captions and stuff. It'll have the watermark. Yeah, so I have the sincere watermark, but maybe some transitions here and there when I piece it all together. Chapter 7, done. I hope you enjoyed it. Continue to enjoy the rest of the playlist when all the other chapters are there. Thanks for watching.